So let me just do a quick intro about BRI. So we're a small boutique consultancy. We focus especially on new business innovation and growth. As Kevin said, we've got many, many years of experience, both as practitioners of new business innovation inside large companies, but also working in collaboration with and consulting for several Fortune 500 companies to help them build out their capabilities. Our services include just consulting, both on new business growth strategy, specific opportunities, but also we provide training for best practices in innovation skills and methodologies. And then we have a software platform called GrowthForge, which is innovation management software platform that helps with the institutionalization of best practices that we cover in a lot of our consulting, and we use it with our clients. Okay, so for today's topic, we're going to talk about new business growth and innovation. A couple of key takeaways that we want to help ensure that you get from today's session. First, just recognizing some of the biggest failure mechanisms for new business innovation. Over the years, personally and working with clients, we've seen pretty consistent patterns of where things tend to break down. And so we just want to highlight those and what to do about them. One of the key elements is really the portfolio strategy. And so what does that really mean and how to do it well? And then finally, the topic of custom governance. And this is really important because we think this is one of the most significant means of mitigating a lot of the key risks that come with new business innovation. Okay, what are some of these common failure mechanisms? First, just missing or poorly defined objectives, right? It's always surprising, but oftentimes we see that the fundamental objectives of what you're trying to accomplish with innovation or new business growth is either poorly articulated or it's missing critical success metrics. And so, this is the fundamental challenge. If you don't know where you're trying to go, it's very difficult to build a strategy to get there. So if you don't have that, you don't know how much growth is needed or by when. And one of the key things is understanding what are the risk tolerances of the organization and what degrees of freedom do you have to operate within. And so these are difficult things to kind of find out on the fly and can really impede and slow down the process. The next one is really ambiguous portfolio strategy or poor discipline in the application of that strategy. So, if the strategy of why you're doing a portfolio and what constitutes the definition of the mix in your portfolio and how you're using that to mitigate and manage risk is often a challenge for people, and organizations look at a portfolio as just a collection of things, and it's more than that. It's an intentional strategy or approach. And the other key one is really just the discipline with which you manage that, right? It's easy to get wrapped up in the specifics of an individual opportunity. And one of the biggest challenges is the discipline to kill things that are mediocre or not good and make way and make resources available for emerging new opportunities. So, what's the type and mix of opportunities that you want to pursue? How many opportunities do you need in your portfolio to deliver the outcomes or goals that you really need? How much do you invest and when? When do you stop investing in opportunities? So those are all questions that if you don't have a clearly defined strategy are very difficult to answer. And finally, inappropriate governance, right? And this is one of the biggest ones that we see where companies tend to end up applying or struggling to apply a different governance to than their core business to the new business growth opportunities, or lacking an ambidextrous leadership that can recognize why those have to be different and how to manage them differently. So the challenge here is really around how do you move quickly and be responsive and responsive to the market and competition and changes, but also when and how to leverage the synergies with the core business. Right. And one of the things that we see over and over is companies try to leverage those synergies too soon. And we'll talk more about that. Okay, so let's start with some specific assumptions because these topics are very broad ranging. The scope of what you're trying to accomplish with portfolio and the contents of that portfolio could be very different. So we're going to make two assumptions. One is that the growth strategy for the company includes portfolio-based investment, right? So we can talk about that. But there's other strategies for growth. So portfolio is just one of multiple potential strategies for growth, but we're assuming that's one of them. And then also that the portfolio includes disruptive innovation, right? So not just incremental innovation of your existing products and business, but really truly disruptive or transformative. So those are the two key things, and we'll talk about each of those. So one, growth via portfolio strategy. So there's three levels of strategy to be mindful of when you're thinking about portfolio strategy. One is what's the growth strategy for the organization as a whole, right? So portfolio strategy in business investment portfolio may just be one element of a broader strategy for growth. And so it's important to understand how it fits in. And if it's not part of the corporate growth strategy, then that's a pretty fundamental challenge because you're going to have a difficult time getting the alignment with the resources and the ambidextrous leadership that you need if it's not formally part of the growth strategy for the company. Secondarily, the portfolio strategy itself is really around defining, what is the target that you're of the growth portion of the growth that you're trying to address with that strategy. What's the diversity criteria and mix in that portfolio? What's the methodology you're going to use to invest to de-risk those opportunities within the portfolio? Is it centralized or decentralized? And what's the governance that you're going to use to manage the portfolio itself, as well as the elements or the opportunities within it? And then finally, there's the specific opportunity strategies within the portfolio. And one of the things that we see is people tend to forget about the portfolio strategy and focus just on the opportunities within it. But those are two distinct levels of strategy that have to be articulated and managed. So the key thing with the opportunities inside the portfolio is really considering them as hypotheses until they've been proven and validated in the market. And each of those strategies is unique and has unique requirements. So, if you don't have a fully articulated strategy for each of these opportunities, it's very difficult to evaluate them because it ends up being very squishy. So we'll talk a little bit more about that as well. Okay, so portfolio strategy is about managing risk, right? The reason you do portfolio is to manage risk. And there's two key ways that you can do that with a portfolio. One is diversifying that risk, right? So like I said earlier, portfolio is not about just doing multiple things. It's about doing multiple things with an intentional mix. And so it's not just about making a couple, one or two or three big bets. It's really about making many small bets so that each one of them has a relatively small risk of loss if you fail. And you're really trying to grow multiple options. The other element is that really what you're trying to do is de-risk those opportunities. So you want to use evidence-based investment scaling. So reduce the uncertainty and risk and scale the investment as your confidence in the outcomes improves. So in order to do that, you have to have a disciplined methodology. And the foundation for any disciplined methodology is having clear goals and metrics. We talked about that up front. But with each opportunity that you're focusing on within the portfolio, the key thing that you're focusing on is really modeling or defining that strategy hypothesis, right? And so that's really trying to articulate, what are the fundamentals of the strategy assumptions, right? And oftentimes we see that companies will articulate like one element of the strategy, but not a comprehensive strategy because there's so many uncertain questions. And so in those cases, it's better to actually define multiple strategies that are self-consistent and complete so that you can compare and evaluate them rather than just being delayed or encumbered by the vagaries of indecisiveness about different elements of the strategy. And it's also very difficult to evaluate, right? So if you can't quantify or do quantitative evaluation or prioritize, which elements of your strategy are the critical questions, then you probably haven't completely defined your strategy comprehensively. So Evaluation serves kind of two purposes. One is just evaluating that relative to the goals and the targets for your portfolio, but also, identifying which are the biggest uncertainties or assumptions that you need to validate or get better data to reduce the uncertainty and risk. And that's really the goal of the next phase, which is really experimentation and evidence gathering. So here's where you want to explicitly define activities to validate the assumptions that you're making in your strategy hypothesis, as well as what data can you gather that helps you reduce the uncertainty and key assumptions that you have. And this should be a very tight and iterative process of refining your strategy, assumptions, validating and getting data. And then there's a formality to the next level, which is often refined as a stage gate kind of process, right? And this is where if you either have defined your strategy and validated it with evidence at enough level of rigor to move to the next stage and scale up the investment, or if you're making a conscious decision to pivot and fundamentally redefine your strategy hypothesis, right? And then you're kind of going back to the beginning. Or you've reached enough evidence to say, this is not a good opportunity and I want to stop. So this is more of a formal process, and there's value in making this a formalized process, putting some ceremony around this process, making this a very transparent process, because that helps reinforce the discipline in this methodology that's very difficult to do. Okay, so looking at a portfolio strategy versus a traditional roadmap. In a portfolio, you're working with an intentional mix, right? A traditional roadmap tends to just define opportunities and execute them, whereas the portfolio, you're trying to define an explicit mix of opportunities, not just a number of things. And also, the portfolio is fundamentally non-deterministic. It's uncertain outcomes. So you have to focus on a target profile of what kind of business and what are the attributes of that business should be, and that's what makes up your portfolio mix. But then many of the concepts that you explore will fail. They won't meet those criteria, and you need to kill them. And so your emphasis needs to be on the whole of the portfolio, not any given opportunity. And that gives you the freedom to say, collectively, the portfolio is making progress towards the goals, but the individual opportunities, some of them may fail, and you prune them out as you go. This has a couple of key implications. One is that investment discipline is really critical. You have to be able to be efficient about aligning opportunities to the investment levels and the time in each of these stages and effectively prune them out. But also the other thing is that companies tend to want to commit revenue around the outcome of the portfolio, right? How much is this going to contribute towards our growth targets? And revenue commitments shouldn't be made until you're in the scaling stage of the business, when all of the critical uncertainties and proving that the business model and the market is there and holds water. So that's another critical piece is really deferring that dependency. Okay, so assumption number 2 is disruptive innovation and the importance of governance. So what is disruptive innovation? So really disruptive innovation, hopefully you're familiar with the concept of core adjacency and adjacency to your core business. Basically, the core business is the thing that drives the growth and revenue of your existing mature business. As you move away in terms of the nature of the product, the market segments you serve, the position in the value chain, or the business models you use, the more of those that are different, the more disruptive or transformational the opportunity is. And as you move away from the core, that risk of execution success increases. Okay, so the risk increases with the distance from the core. If there's a potential to meet the strategic growth objectives with your core, with incremental or sustaining innovation in your core, by all means focus there first, right? That's the lowest risk and has the highest degree of synergies with your core. So if you can achieve the goals that way, do it. But typically what happens is if the goals or the aspirations for growth are more than what can be achieved through incremental innovation in the existing business, that's when you start having to explore these more disruptive or more transformational types of opportunities. And that's where the execution risk goes up. And so therefore you need to take special action to deal with those. And the biggest challenge is that these disruptive opportunities are basically misaligned with the resources, processes, and priorities of the core business. And this is a key term that we really focus on. This comes from Harvard Business Review discussion around how companies operate. And basically, RPPs are simply a way of describing what companies do in their core business. And so the resources are things like budgets and people and technology and assets. The processes are just, the methodologies for how they get things done, and priorities are really the priorities from that core business model. And the challenge with this is that the decisions are typically made around resources, and resources are very easy to redirect and change. The challenge is within processes and priorities. The processes and priorities get embedded into the culture of an organization, and they're often not explicitly stated or understood. They're very implicit, and these are the very difficult things to change. And if those are things that are really aligned to the nature of the core business, then your new opportunity needs something different than those, then you run into these challenges. And these misalignments are often small, but they accumulate to great effect on the organization, or on the new business opportunity. So these are the things that are often referred to as the antibodies, right? That fight new business growth. They feel like friction or points of frustration, or why don't these people get it? And they're very difficult to see in terms of the cumulative impact of them. So what they end up doing is slowly either creating a number of small delays, right, and friction, or a number of compromises to the new business that fundamentally makes it non-competitive with the market. And so this is kind of similar to the analogy of the slowly boiling frog, right, where you really don't see it happening until it's too late. And in our experience, this is the #1 killer of innovation in mature organizations, right? It's very difficult to see, and the impact is significant. So the fundamentals are really that the sustaining or core business work is fundamentally different than the nature of exploration or what you do in a new business portfolio. In the sustaining business, it's really focused on optimization, predictability, and low risk, right? And you're trying to maximize the return, and you want to make bigger bets, and failure is not an option. In the exploration work, it's really about discovery. You want to learn quickly. You want to make minimum affordable loss as to what you're focused on financially. And really, you're trying to learn and discover where the value is and how to create that value. And those are fundamentally different approaches to managing the opportunity. So ambidextrous leaders tend to recognize the differences and manage these two types of activities differently. And ambidextrous organizations institutionalize tailored systems of governance and the interfaces between them to manage these two different types of operation. So this is where you get a really challenging catch-22 for doing new business innovation in a mature company. On one hand, you're trying to create value through the synergies with your core business, right? That's why you're doing it within the company rather than just going off and doing a startup or creating a new business, right? But the challenge is that the more different that new business is from your core, you have this significant execution risk from RPP misalignments, right? And that happens whether it's doing organic growth or whether you're trying to do an M&A, right? If you're trying to bring in an external company, it by definition has different RPPs and therefore is going to run into these challenges. So the solution to managing this is custom governance structure for the new opportunities and ambidextrous leadership. So what is governance? Governance is basically just the means by which you're balancing the new business's autonomy with the opportunity to leverage synergies from the core business and manage the difference between those RPPs. So you're typically looking for, and this is not just the org structure, this is all elements of how that business is governed. So it's the charter, the priorities, the decision-making criteria and methodologies. It's the team and the culture, and then also the structure and operational flexibility. Right. So you have to look at each one of these elements of the business and say, which of those can I successfully leverage from the core business? Which of those do I have to build uniquely for this capability of this business? And which of those can I buy or partner externally to source? And so that's going to be different for every opportunity. And some things that you may do internally for the core business, you may want to outsource for the new opportunity. So what's a framework for defining or thinking about how we can structure the right type of governance? One critical element is just looking for that proximity to the core, right? So that really helps identify the risk from RPP alignment or misalignment. The second dimension is what's the state of the maturity of the new opportunity? Is it in its infancy, or is it proven and validated in the market, or are you scaling? And then what are the different governance approaches? And some of these have names, and some of these are just well known already as different concepts. So we've put that into a 2x2 matrix, and basically, you can map the type of a governance approach to the combination of maturity and adjacency of that business. So opportunities take different paths through these processes. And so your traditional core business, you basically have some type of research lab, new product development into mature business operation. In exploring adjacent or transformational businesses in their early stage, you may be in some type of an incubator, right? But then they may evolve or graduate into a special business unit where they have more structure around them. If you're doing an acquisition, it may also be integrated in a similar kind of way before they ultimately become part of the core operations. So you may have a project that's in your R&D lab, but it doesn't fit with your other businesses. So the best path for it might be through the incubator. Right? You may incubate things and go through this whole stage and scale them into maturity. You may realize during the process that they actually fit more closely with your core business and therefore go into your new product development pipeline. You may also take opportunities and say the best way to scale this business is actually to do an acquisition. And if you've done some incubation and market validation in your incubator, you may have better targets or better insight into evaluating the acquisition options before you scale them that way. You may also decide that it's not a good fit for the company, but you've created some value, so you can spin it out. You may make strategic equity investments in external companies as a way of getting around those RPP misalignment points. But at the end of the day, if you want to capture that value as part of your revenue growth, you would have to acquire or bring that in, which also requires an independent governance framework for how you do that. So at the end of the day, governance is an active management process. So you have your core business operating model, which is really efficient and is good about leveraging synergies. At the same time, your external opportunities have more fully autonomous governance. They have the flexibility and focus to be highly responsive to the market and competition, but they don't leverage the synergies. So you're trying to create with governance essentially a framework to balance the best of both of those, but also manage them appropriately over the maturity of the life cycle of the business. So you want a semi-autonomous capability in each of these. But in the incubation stage, you're going to start with something that's more autonomous, right, and independent from your core business. As you start to scale that business, then you want to start looking at opportunities to leverage synergies with your core before ultimately it gets to the scale where it starts to actually change the definition of your core because it's big enough to actually be comparatively competitive or self-sustaining alongside and start to integrate with that core itself. So I'm a little over my time. There's a couple of other advanced topics like how you forecast and size your portfolio with modeling, ambidextrous leadership. There's some other talks within this Learning Lab session this week on this. And then also a functional interface team, which is essentially how do you take that ambidextrous capability and institutionalize it into the structure of how your organization operates as one of the governance mechanisms. But we don't have time for those. So just in summary, the key requirements for successful new business innovation is clear vision and aspirational goals, making sure that those objectives and success metrics are clear and quantifiable, having a complete and viable portfolio strategy, appropriate budgets and skills, balanced vectors of risk, and having a continuous pipeline. If you don't have new things coming in, it's very difficult to kill things that are not worth pursuing. And then finally, having that right executive leadership and governance to support the execution. So that was probably a little bit too much for the time, but thanks for your attention, and we'll open it up to Q&A.
Thanks, Jim. Very insightful on just business growth and also the portfolio management. Just going to questions. Ram, you had a question. I'll just read it out. Ram asks if BSCs, which are balanced scorecards, aren't they better than RPPS for evaluation?
Well, a balanced scorecard doesn't necessarily tell you what the failure mechanisms or the challenges might be, right? They may tell you the risk of the opportunity. I mean, there's lots of different kinds of balanced scorecards, so I guess it kind of depends on what one you're talking about. But there's lots of different mechanisms for kind of testing the level of adjacency to the core. But understanding where those mismatches are doesn't necessarily help you mitigate them, right? So the governance structure is really putting in the place the means to mitigate where those key risks are. And again, it's finding that balance between what synergies you want to capitalize on and then what misalignment risk you need to mitigate.
Okay, great. Thanks, Jim. Any other questions from the audience?
Can I ask one question, Rajit here? In your experience, Jim, thanks for the presentation first. Yeah, I just want to kind of leverage on your experience. What kind of timelines do you see? Because this kind of super lot of alignments, different functions getting aligned together, having that model. What is the timeline? That's one question you've seen in the past in a corporate. And what would you suggest as an MVP of this within the company to start?
Yeah, those are great questions. So the timeline can vary dramatically depending on just the size of the organization and then also the level of support that the senior leadership has and then how engaged they are in the process, right? It also depends on sort of how much the culture of the organization is predisposed to understanding these exploratory capabilities and the ability to recognize the difference between, the optimization for the core. A lot of times what we find is that the more mature the company is with a singular type of business, the harder it is to do. So if you have a business that has multiple business models in it, right, and different kind of organizational independent units, it's a little bit easier because there's some recognition of the difference between those things. But the process for setting this up can be, probably, within 6 months to a year, depending on the size of the organization. Smaller organizations may be able to do it in less than that, but you're doing a lot of kind of mindset resetting, right? And there's a lot of stakeholders that need to be involved in the process to get buy-in. In terms of an MVP, I think you could probably look at it instead of doing a whole portfolio, it's trying to apply those methods to a single low risk opportunity, right? And so use that to sort of demonstrate here's the theory, right, of the process and methods we want to try to adopt. And then here's a singular experiment that we can do that sort of demonstrates the process and how those might work. And then really going to just scale up the number of experiments, right, and where you might do that. So that's kind of the quick off the top of my head without much context.
No, fair enough. I think this is something which I've seen as well. Like companies try to do a lot through alignment, but I think what has worked I have seen is by showing them the small, quick wins. So picking up 2 or 3 ideas, just going through the whole funnel you explained. To even if it fails at the end, that doesn't matter. But you've gone through it and seen for yourself what works within your company and what doesn't. This has given
and oftentimes one of the dimensions of diversity in the portfolio that we recommend is what is the time to success, right? So you may have some really great opportunities, but if it's going to take 3 years before you really materialize and see that, it's not going to give you enough, fast enough response to get support from management. So there needs to be a mix of quick wins in that diversity mix as well to help build the confidence in the approach.
As the team is thinking about adopting, some of your recommendations, what investment would they put into the different categories in the portfolio, whether that be, grow the core compared to really disruptive? What do you generally see?
I don't think there's a singular pattern. It really depends a lot on what the objectives are. And then that's where we kind of use the portfolio modeling to sort of, do a profile of what these businesses and their risk profiles and return profile kind of look like for the different categories or dimensions of the portfolio. And then we use kind of financial and Monte Carlo simulation to kind of project out, given the potential results of that mix of that portfolio and those failure rates, how much do you need to invest to achieve the growth target, right? And so you can work either from what you can afford to invest and project forward what kind of growth you can generate from that, or you work back from your goal and say, how much do I need to invest to be able to, have a high probability of achieving that growth outcome, right? And those can be very different depending on the nature of the business and the nature of the growth agenda, right?
Right.
I have a question. This is Ram. Any reason why you have a single funnel for both sustaining and disruptive innovation? In my experience, it's better to have sustaining innovation embedded into the R&D or BUs, and then use a portfolio approach for Explorer.
Yeah, absolutely. And that is kind of the, sorry if that didn't come through, but that is kind of the intent of this slide here, right? Is that your core business, which is your sustaining innovation, is really happening through your core business governance, right? And it's your adjacent and transformational stuff that happened through this other alternative process, right?
Okay.
Yeah,
just to
so
clarify, because your funnel didn't clarify that, and it looked as though all of them are going into the same funnel.
Yeah, sorry about that. That was not the intent. The funnel is really for this incubation part of the process, not the core business. Yeah, thanks for clarifying that.
Oh, one of the best presentations I have seen so far. So fantastic.
Oh, thank you. Appreciate that. This is our first time with the Innov8rs community, so we're trying to just get a feel for who the participants are and where your kind of areas of questions are and needs. So thanks.
Jim, if the participants want to reach out to you, I guess LinkedIn is one way, but is there any other way that you would prefer?
We also, I think the presentation materials has our email, and you can just email us directly. And then you can also just go to our website, which is just BRI-Associates.com, and we have a contact form there that comes to us as well. So
okay, that's great, Jim. Thank you very much for a very insightful session.
Yeah, sorry for cramming a little bit too much in there, but
not a problem.
Appreciate your
Thanks
patience.
everyone for joining as well.
All right, thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye.